Welcome to Unit 9, Utilities and Best Practices. Now, by utilities, what I mean is basically stuff that didn't quite fit into the earlier sections. I mentioned that jQuery had three primary areas: finding stuff in the page, changing stuff in the page, and doing Ajax. Well, jQuery also has a bunch of functions that do, other things as well that doesn't fit into a nice bucket. That's what we're talking about in this unit. So some of the things I'll be showing are actually covered by modern browsers. So if you're only using the very latest Chrome, the very latest Firefox, you may not need these. But if you're worried about older browsers and being compatible, these functions may be helpful to you. And to be clear, I'm showing a list of what I think is interesting. Definitely check the documentation for a complete list of all the utilities out there to see what jQuery has to offer. With that in mind, let's look at some examples. So the first example I want to show is a function called trim, and all it does is trim a string. So JavaScript for a while now has had a rtrim and ltrim, basically take white space off the front or the end of a string, but it didn't have a function to do it on both sides. Now, modern JavaScript has that, but again, if you want to cover the older browsers, jQuery has it built in. So this particular page we're looking at, this is the fancy GitHub searcher demo from the earlier unit. And all I've done is modify the code a bit so that when it gets a search value, it does a trim on it. And just to be sure that it worked, I'm doing some console before and after. Now what's nice about this is that if all you do is compare against an empty string, if a user enters a space character, well, that won't match an empty string and your validation will fail. Or a user may just accidentally type a space at the end of a search. This code will remove those spaces and ensure that they actually do type something and remove any mistakes. Let's run this just to see the trim in play. All right, here is my GitHub searcher. I'm going to type in Ray and not include spaces, and it works okay. But now I'll accidentally put some spaces at the end, hit search, and you can see here it is before the trim, and there it is after. Pretty cool. The next example involves different things that jQuery can do with arrays. And again, these are things that modern browsers kind of have built in, but again, jQuery is going to make it compatible with the older ones. In the first example, I'm doing $.grep. What this does is look at an array and allows you to say for each item in that array, I'm going to do some check on it. And if I return true, I'm going to return that particular element. So what I've done is said less than 5 equals $.grep against data. Data is simply an array of 10 items. I built a basic filter function that says if element, that's the actual array element, if it's less than 5, return true. So what will happen is that less than 5 will be an array of values that are less than 5. A related function is $.map. This will look at every item in an array, and what I return from this function, this little callback function here, will be mapped back to a new array. So what this function is doing is basically saying, give me an array of numbers and return that array where every value is multiplied by 2. Finally, we have $.merge, which, as you can guess, takes one array and adds it to the other. Now in this case, it's not returning an array. It's taking the second array and putting it on top of the first one. That's why I'm doing a console.log on data, and you'll see that it will be modified. Let's run this and see what it does. All right, this is one more example where everything is being done in console. You can see my less than 5 are all the items that were less than 5. You can see my example where I multiplied all the items by 2. And then finally, the merge example where I took that array and put it on top of my original. Pretty simple, but pretty powerful. The next thing we're going to look at is jQuery's functions that allow us to take array-like things and turn them into arrays. Now, what do I mean by that? There are a couple things in JavaScript land that act a bit like arrays, but aren't really arrays. There's a couple examples of this, but one of them is the arguments object that exists for a function. So look at this example here. I have a function called something, and I'm going to call it in this pass of a bunch of stuff. And I could treat the argument's value like an array. I can do .length on it, and I could iterate over it and look at those values and, hey, it must be a lot like an array. How about doing pop to get the last item? Let's run this and see what happens. Alright, so here's the example in the console. You can see it got the length okay, it got each value okay, but at the end we got an error saying undefined is not a function. Why is that so? Well, arguments is not really an array. It just looks like one, smells like one, but it's not an array, and therefore doesn't have the pop method. jQuery provides a utility to fix this, and it's called makeArray. And I could literally say arguments equals $.makeArray arguments. And this will rewrite arguments as a proper array. Now when I run this one, the .pop is going to work just fine. And there we go. You see the length still worked, the iteration still worked, and finally the pop worked because now I have a real array. Let's look at one more utility. So one of the things that jQuery does to make your life a little bit easier is to alias itself to the $sign. There is a chance that you may be working with code that also uses the $sign. Well, jQuery makes it super easy to stop doing that. It's called no conflict. On line 10, I'm saying jQuery.noConflict, and as soon as I've done that, I can no longer use the $sign symbol. But I also don't have to worry about jQuery blowing it up. So now instead of doing $document.ready or $.grep in this example, I simply do jQuery dot instead. Now if I run this, it's going to function the exact same. The only thing that's changing is that little simple alias. It's no longer there. If I want to bring an alias back, that's also pretty easy. I could simply say some variable equals jQuery no conflict. In this case, I've said Ray, and I strongly recommend that you also use Ray. And once I've done that, Ray essentially acts like an alias for the jQuery library. So I can do Ray document.ready, ray.grep, ray.map. I could pass a selector to Ray. Ray is essentially jQuery. So now let's turn our attention to some best practices. Now, a quick warning here. Best practices are almost always never 100% true. Sometimes they're pretty darn close to 100%. So take what I'm about to show you with a small grain of salt. These are procedures that in general you should follow, but most likely you can find a case where they're not true. That's going to be something that all best practices have in common. But what we're going to talk about today are things that in general are considered to be things that people should do when working with jQuery. Now don't forget that the generic best practices for for JavaScript also apply. So the things that you've heard about doing JavaScript well also apply when you're working with jQuery, obviously. I recommend two tools to help with that, JSHint and JSLint. These are tools that will actually look at your code and point out things that you're doing wrong or could do better. Now, they don't have specific things to handle jQuery, but they'll find the other mistakes you make as well. And trust me, they will find quite a few of them. So one of the first things you can do is caching selectors. We've already talked a bit about this earlier. It's the simple thing of taking a selector and caching it so you can reuse it again. Now, I mentioned before that the typical practice is to use a $sign in front of the variable name. That's totally not required, but it flags kind of visually that that particular variable name field is a result of a jQuery selector. And basically, this ensures that you don't have to keep re-looking things up in the DOM to find things. Speaking of that, there are also some rules involved for when you do a selector. So the general rules are IDs are the best selectors available, tags are the second best, and class names are the worst. So how about some practical examples of that? So imagine this simple list here, and I want to find all the LIs that have a class of myFav. Well, I could do it with just .myFav, but by doing a tag in front of it, li.myFav, I've made my selector a bit more specific. And instead of jQuery having to search the entire DOM for everything that has a myFav class, it can instead find the LIs instead and then filter by those that have that particular class. I can do it even better by just adding a simple ID to my UL. Now I'm saying find that particular ID, and that'll be really fast, and then find the LI underneath it. So what about DOM manipulation? So in general, changing the DOM is slow. When you add a new paragraph or a new picture, the browser has to do work to kind of rejigger that into the entire DOM. So the general rule is to try to do one change as opposed to many changes. So imagine this example. I have a loop, and for each iteration of the loop, I'm going to find the selector, ID of something, and I'm going to append some HTML into it. I'm actually doing 10 different DOM manipulations just to add some text to something. It'd be nicer if I instead built up a simple string and then at the very end do my DOM manipulation. Another way of doing this is to work with document fragments. I can actually create my own DOM. In this case, I'm doing a selector on div, and notice the less than and greater than. This is actually a brand new div tag, and I could append to that. And what I'm doing here is essentially manipulating a virtual new DOM. When I'm done, I could take that and append it into my selector, and this will be more performant.